December 17th, 1887. The explosion had happened 3 days prior, and the Blackwood mine was still burning. Smoke poured from the main shaft like breath from a wounded beast, black and thick and carrying the smell of things that should never burn, timber and coal and flesh and hope. 63 men had been underground when the fire damp ignited. 63 men who would never see daylight again, sealed behind a wall of collapsed stone that the rescue crews had finally stopped trying to breach. The mine that had given Coalvale, Pennsylvania, its name, its purpose, and its prosperity was now a tomb, and the coal that had heated every home in the valley for 20 years was as unreachable as the moon. The temperature that morning was 14 degrees below zero and falling. In the homes of Coalvale, the cook stoves and heating stoves that had burned cheerfully all autumn now sat cold or nearly so. The company store, which had always sold coal to miners at prices deducted from their wages, had nothing left to sell. The rail spur that connected the town to the outside world was buried under 6 feet of snow, and the telegram wires were down, snapped by ice somewhere between here and civilization. Coalvale was alone, freezing and running out of time. But on the hill above town, in a sturdy frame house with a fieldstone foundation, Tobias Merrick opened the door to his coal shed and contemplated the black mountain within. 18 tons, 36,000 pounds of Pennsylvania anthracite, stacked and sorted and covered against the weather, representing 3 years of careful accumulation. The people of Coalvale had called him many things for building this stockpile: hoarder, miser, fool. Duncan Cahill, the mine superintendent, had publicly accused him of stealing from the company. The preacher had suggested from his pulpit that such accumulation bordered on the sin of greed. Tobias had said nothing. He had simply continued to buy coal, load by load, until his shed could hold no more. Now he stood in the doorway, his breath pluming white, and calculated. 18 tons. The town had perhaps 600 souls. If he rationed carefully, if he distributed only enough to keep people from freezing, not enough to keep them comfortable, 18 tons might last 3 weeks, maybe 4. Long enough, perhaps, for the weather to break, for the rail line to be cleared, for help to arrive from the outside world. His dapple-gray gelding, Ember, nickered from the stable. Tobias had named him for the color of his coat, which shifted from pale silver to deep charcoal like coals fading in a grate. It seemed appropriate now, given what was to come. "Well, old friend," Tobias said quietly, "I suppose they'll be coming round soon." He had arrived in Coalvale in the spring of 1879, a man of 34 with a game leg and a lifetime of hard-won knowledge. He had worked the mines since the age of 12, first as a breaker boy, picking slate from the coal that rattled past on endless conveyor belts, then as a door boy, opening and closing the ventilation doors in the deep tunnels, then as a miner proper, swinging a pick in passages so low he could not stand upright. He knew coal the way a farmer knows soil, the way a sailor knows water. He knew its moods, its dangers, its secrets. The accident that ended his mining career had happened in 1878 in a shaft in Scranton. A support timber had given way without warning, bringing down a section of roof that caught Tobias's left leg beneath a beam. The leg had been saved, but it would never bend properly again. The mining company had given him $50 and a letter stating that his services were no longer required. He had used the money to travel west, seeking a place where a crippled miner might still make a life. Coalvale had seemed promising. The Blackwood mine was new and profitable. The town was growing, and there was work for a man who understood coal even if he could no longer dig it. Tobias found employment as a weighmaster, operating the scales where coal cars were measured before being sent to market. It was sedentary work beneath his abilities, but it paid wages and kept him close to the industry he understood. More importantly, it gave him access to information that others did not have. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether you're in coal country, the mountains, or somewhere the winters bite just as hard. These lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the mine goes silent and winter arrives. The Blackwood mine was profitable, but it was not safe. Tobias recognized the signs within his first month of employment: the shortcuts, the deferred maintenance, the production quotas that pushed men to work faster than prudence allowed. Duncan Cahill, the superintendent who ran the operation for the owners in Philadelphia, cared about tonnage and nothing else. The ventilation was inadequate. The timber supports were spaced too far apart. The fire damp, the explosive methane gas that seeped from coal seams, was not being monitored properly. Tobias had tried to raise these concerns. He had written a letter to the company owners, detailing the dangers he observed. The letter had been intercepted by Cahill, who had called Tobias into his office and informed him, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that his continued employment depended on his continued silence. "You're a weighmaster, Merrick," Cahill had said, his narrow face tight with barely contained anger. "You weigh coal. You do not inspect mines. You do not write letters to Philadelphia. You do not concern yourself with matters above your station. Are we clear?" Tobias had nodded. He had kept his job, and he had begun, quietly and systematically, to prepare for the disaster he knew was coming. His first purchase was modest, an extra ton of coal, bought from the company store at the standard rate. He stored it in a shed behind the small house he rented on the hill above town. The following month, he bought another ton, and another, and another. The accumulation drew attention almost immediately. "Merrick's building himself a coal pile," reported Ned Slattery, the company's store clerk, to anyone who would listen. "Buying a ton a month, regular as clockwork. What's a single man need with that much coal?" The question spread through Coalville with the speed of all small-town gossip. Tobias Merrick was hoarding coal. Tobias Merrick, the crippled weighmaster with the bad leg and the quiet manner, was stockpiling fuel like a squirrel stockpiling nuts. Duncan Cahill heard the rumors and did not like them. A man who hoarded coal was a man who did not trust the mine to keep producing. Such distrust, if it spread, could undermine the confidence that kept workers working and investors investing. "The weighmaster is hoarding," Cahill announced at a meeting of the town's leading citizens. The store manager, the saloon keeper, the foreman, the preacher. Buying coal he doesn't need, storing it against some imaginary catastrophe. It's bad for morale. It suggests that the mine might fail. "Can we stop him?" asked Horace Putnam, who served as mayor by virtue of being the only man in Coalville willing to attend the endless meetings the position required. "He's buying at fair market rates," Cahill admitted. "We can't refuse to sell to him, but we can make our displeasure known." And they did. The whisper campaign began immediately and never relented. Tobias was a hoarder. Tobias was greedy. Tobias was buying coal that other families might need, stockpiling it for his own selfish purposes while honest miners lived hand to mouth. The preacher, Reverend Ezekiel Moss, addressed the matter from his pulpit on a Sunday in October of 1884. "The Lord teaches us to trust in His providence," Moss intoned, his voice carrying the particular resonance of a man who has confused his own opinions with divine instruction. To stockpile earthly goods against future want is to doubt that providence. It is to say, with our actions, if not our words, that we do not believe God will provide. He did not name Tobias directly, but everyone knew who he meant. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now back to the story. Through 1884, 1885, and 1886, Tobias continued his accumulation. He expanded his coal shed twice, building it larger and stronger, lining the floor with gravel for drainage, installing a proper roof to keep out rain and snow. He organized his stockpile by size and grade, keeping the best anthracite, the hard, clean-burning coal that produced the most heat with the least ash, separate from the softer grades. He covered each section with canvas, protecting it from the elements. He also kept records. Every load purchased, every dollar spent, every ton added to the pile. His ledger showed the steady growth of an investment that most of Coalville considered madness. By the autumn of 1887, the coal shed held 18 tons. "You could heat this house for 10 years with what you've got in that shed," observed Abel Coombs, the elderly neighbor who sometimes shared a pipe with Tobias on summer evenings. Coombs was one of the few people in Coalville who did not openly mock Tobias's stockpile, though he clearly did not understand it either. "I could," Tobias agreed, "but I don't expect I'll need to." Coombs had given him a puzzled look, but asked no further questions. The mine continued to produce. The dangers Tobias had identified continued to be ignored. He watched the coal cars roll out of the shaft, watched the men descend each morning into darkness that he alone seemed to understand was growing more deadly by the day. He said nothing. He had learned that warnings fell on deaf ears, and that the only preparation a man could truly rely upon was his own. The fire-damp explosion occurred at 2:47 p.m. on December 14th, 1887. The blast was felt throughout Coalville, a deep, concussive thump that rattled windows and shook the ground. Those who had experience with such things knew immediately what it meant. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered at the mine entrance, watching in horror as black smoke began to pour from the shaft. The rescue effort lasted 36 hours before Cahill called it off. The collapse was too extensive. The fire had spread to the coal seam itself, which would burn for months, possibly years. The 63 men underground were beyond saving. Their families would receive the bodies, if at all, only after the fire burned itself out, a process that might take longer than anyone could wait. The mine that had given Coalville its reason for existence was dead, and winter was just beginning. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now back to the story. The first crisis was grief. 63 men dead meant 63 families shattered. Widows and orphans and parents who had outlived their sons. The funeral stretched over a week, the frozen ground yielding reluctantly to pickaxes and shovels, the graves multiplying on the hillside like a crop of sorrow. The second crisis was cold. The company store had maintained a modest inventory of coal for sale to miners who wished to purchase beyond their company-issued rations. That inventory was exhausted within 4 days of the explosion. The mine's surface stockpile, coal that had been extracted but not yet shipped, was substantial, but it belonged to the company, and the company was headquartered in Philadelphia, and the telegraph wires were down, and no one in Coalvale had the authority to distribute company property without authorization. Duncan Cahill, who might have claimed such authority, had fled town on the second day after the disaster. He had ridden out before dawn, heading east toward the rail junction, leaving behind a town full of people who blamed him, correctly, for the conditions that had caused the explosion. His departure was cowardice dressed as strategy, and it left Coalvale without even the pretense of leadership. Mayor Putnam called emergency meetings. Committees were formed. Resolutions were passed. None of it produced a single lump of coal. The temperature dropped. The snow deepened. The stoves that had burned day and night all autumn began to flicker and fail as families exhausted their meager supplies. Children huddled under every blanket in the house. The elderly stopped getting out of bed. The sick, who needed warmth most of all, were the first to feel its absence. The first death from cold came on December 19th. Old Mrs. Halverson, who had lived alone since her husband died in a different mine collapse 15 years prior. She was found in her cabin with an empty coal bin and a stove that had gone cold sometime in the night. She had wrapped herself in quilts and waited for warmth that never came. 2 more deaths followed in the next 3 days. A child of 4, a man of 72. The list would grow, everyone knew, unless something changed. Tobias Merrick changed it. On the morning of December the 20th, he hitched Ember to his sledge and loaded it with half a ton of coal, 1,000 pounds of heat, of life, of hope. He drove down the hill into Coalvale, his breath pluming white, the runners squeaking on the frozen snow. He stopped first at the company store, where a crowd had gathered in futile hope that somehow, magically, supplies might have appeared overnight. The faces that turned toward him were gaunt with grief and pinched with cold. "I have coal," Tobias said simply. 18 tons, stored against exactly this day. He gestured at the sledge. "This load is for the families with children under 10. Send them to me, and I'll distribute more." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Ned Slattery, the store clerk who had reported Tobias's hoarding 3 years before, stepped forward. 18 tons, Slattery repeated. "You've had 18 tons of coal sitting in your shed while we've been freezing." "I have," Tobias agreed. "And now I'm sharing it. Would you prefer I had not?" Slattery had no answer to that. The distribution began within the hour. Tobias established a system. Families with young children received first priority, then families with elderly members, then families with sick members, then everyone else. He measured carefully, giving each household enough to warm 1 room for 3 days. It was not enough for comfort, but it was enough for survival. He made 4 trips that first day, delivering 2 tons of coal to the families who needed it most. He continued the next day, and the next, working from dawn until his hands were too numb to grip the shovel. Ember bore the labor without complaint, hauling load after load down the frozen hill. The coal pile that had taken 3 years to build began to shrink. Tobias watched the level drop and calculated constantly, adjusting his distributions, stretching his supplies, trying to make 18 tons last until help could arrive. Mayor Putnam visited on the 3rd day, climbing the hill with a delegation of town notables, the men who had whispered about Tobias's greed, who had nodded along with the preacher's sermon about trusting in providence. "Mr. Merrick," Putnam began, his tone carefully neutral, "the town is grateful for your generosity. We were wondering if you might consider, that is to say, if you would be willing to—" "You want me to give it away faster," Tobias said. "More coal per family, warmer houses. The people are suffering. They are. And if I give away everything I have in the next week, they will suffer more in the weeks after that. I'm rationing because I must, Mayor. If I don't, we'll all freeze together in January instead of separately in December. That's not an improvement." Putnam's delegation exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had come hoping for generosity and found something more useful: prudence. "How long can you keep this up?" Putnam asked. "If the weather holds and help arrives within a month, we'll make it, barely. If the weather worsens or help is delayed," Tobias shrugged, "then we do the best we can with what we have. What can we do to help?" Tobias considered the question. "Organize the distribution. Keep records of who's received what. Identify the families in greatest need. I can provide the coal, but I cannot be everywhere at once." It was the beginning of a cooperation that Tobias had never sought, but now accepted as necessary. The mayor's delegation, which had come to negotiate for more, left instead with responsibilities. They would help stretch the hoarder's stockpile because stretching it was the only way they would survive. The widows of the mine disaster were among the hardest cases. 63 families suddenly without breadwinners, facing a winter that had killed their husbands and now threatened to kill them too. Tobias gave them priority, not because their suffering was greater than others, but because their resources were fewer. A widow with 4 children and no income needed more help than a family whose wage earner was merely unemployed. Reverend Moss, who had preached against hoarding from his pulpit 3 years prior, came to Tobias's door on Christmas Eve. The preacher looked diminished, thinner, older, the certainty gone from his eyes. He held his hat in his hands and could not quite meet Tobias's gaze. "Mr. Merrick," he said, "I spoke against you, from the pulpit. I called your preparations a sin." "You did. I was wrong." The words came slowly, as if each one had to be extracted. "I called it greed when it was prudence. I called it faithlessness when it was foresight. The coal you hoarded is keeping my congregation alive. It's keeping everyone alive, Reverend, including people who never set foot in your church." Moss nodded. "Yes, including them." He was quiet for a moment. "I came to apologize and to ask if there's anything I can do to help." Tobias studied the man who had condemned him. The preacher was sincere, that much was clear. Whatever pride had fueled his certainty 3 years ago had been burned away by the cold reality of this December. "You can help distribute," Tobias said. "The families trust you. Visit them. Make sure the coal is being used wisely. Report back to me on who needs more and who can manage with less." It was not forgiveness, exactly, but it was acceptance, and for now, that would have to be enough. The rail line was cleared on January 8th, 1889. A crew from Harrisburg, working around the clock for a week, had dug through the snow and ice to reach the isolated valley. The first train through carried emergency supplies, food, medicine, and coal from the mines to the south that had not collapsed. By then, Tobias's stockpile was reduced to 3 tons. He had distributed 15 tons of coal over 23 days, heating more than 200 homes, keeping 600 people alive through the worst of the winter. The deaths from cold had stopped after Mrs. Halverson and the two who followed. Without his coal, the doctor later estimated, at least 30 more would have perished. A gathering was called for the second week of January, held in the church where Reverend Moss had once preached against hoarding. The pews were packed, not with worshipers, but with survivors who had come to acknowledge what had happened and to honor the man who had made their survival possible. Mayor Putnam spoke first, his voice carrying an emotion that town council meetings had never required of him. 3 years ago, this town whispered about Tobias Merrick. We called him a hoarder. We called him greedy. We suggested that his stockpiling was a sign of faithlessness, of selfishness, of a character flaw that decent people did not possess. He paused, his jaw working. We were wrong, every word of it. What we called hoarding was preparation. What we called greed was generosity waiting for the moment it was needed. Mr. Merrick saw what was coming when the rest of us were blind. He prepared when the rest of us trusted luck, and when the worst happened, he shared everything he had, asking nothing in return. Ned Slattery rose next, the store clerk who had first reported Tobias's purchases to the superintendent. His face was red with a shame that went beyond embarrassment. I kept records of what Mr. Merrick bought, Slattery said. Every ton. I reported it to Cahill like it was evidence of a crime. I helped start the talk that made this man an outcast in his own town. His voice cracked. My children are alive because of him. My wife is alive. I am alive. And I treated him like a thief. Others spoke. The widows whose coal had come from Tobias's shed. The elderly who had been kept warm when their own supplies ran out. The parents whose children had survived because a man they had mocked had prepared for exactly this disaster. When the confessions had run their course, Tobias rose from his seat in the back. He walked to the front of the church with the uneven gait that marked him, the legacy of a mining accident that had taken his mobility, but not his foresight. I worked in mines for 22 years, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying. I saw men die because the companies they worked for did not prepare for danger. I saw families freeze because the companies they depended on did not stockpile against disaster. I learned something in those years that I could not unlearn. The only preparation you can trust is the preparation you make yourself. He looked around the room. I did not stockpile coal because I doubted this town. I stockpiled because I understood this industry. I knew the mine was dangerous. I knew that someday, somehow, it would fail. I did not know when or how. I only knew that when it did, the people who depended on it would need help. He paused. You called me greedy. Perhaps I was. Greedy for the safety of my neighbors. Greedy for the survival of children I did not know. Greedy for the chance to repay a debt I owe to every miner who ever went underground and did not come back up. He drew a breath. I have 3 tons of coal remaining. It will see my household through the winter, but I will teach anyone who wishes to learn why I prepared and how. The mine is gone. But the lesson does not have to die with it. Prepare. Stockpile. Trust your own judgment over the assurances of those who profit from your dependency. If this town learns nothing else from what we have endured, let it learn that. Thank you for watching this story about Tobias Merrick and the coal stockpile of Coalvale. When we mock the cautious, we often find ourselves dependent on their foresight. If this story reminded you that preparation is not paranoia but wisdom, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever called you greedy for preparing when they should have called you wise? The rebuilding of Coalvale took years. Without the mine, the town had to reinvent itself, finding new industries, new purposes, new reasons to exist. Many families left, seeking work in other mining towns, other valleys, other lives. But some stayed, the ones who had roots too deep to tear up, the ones who had nowhere else to go, the ones who had learned something during that terrible December that they were not willing to forget. Tobias stayed. He used the last of his savings to purchase a small plot of land on the hill where he had rented his house, and he built a new structure, larger, sturdier, with a coal shed big enough to hold 30 tons. He never needed that capacity, as the mines to the south kept Coalvale supplied for the rest of his days. But the shed was there, filled and ready, a monument to a lesson that should never have needed teaching. Mayor Putnam established a town fuel reserve, funded by a small levy on every household. The reserve held 50 tons of coal, stored in a stone building on the edge of town, available to any family in need during emergencies. It was called the Merrick Reserve, over Tobias's objections, and it served Coalvale through 3 more hard winters without a single death from cold. Reverend Moss retired from preaching in 1891, his faith shaken by the experience of watching Providence fail where preparation had succeeded. He spent his remaining years working at the Merrick Reserve, distributing coal to those in need, making amends in the only way he knew how. The phrase "filling the shed" entered the vocabulary of the Pennsylvania coal country and spread to mining towns across the Appalachians. It meant preparing for disaster during times of prosperity, stockpiling against the day when the mines would fail, as all mines eventually did. It was spoken with quiet conviction, as if the speaker understood something about foresight that could only be learned through survival. Tobias Merrick lived in Coalvale for another 27 years, passing in the spring of 1914 at the age of 69. His leg, which had ended his mining career and sent him on the journey that saved 600 lives, never stopped paining him. But he bore it as he bore most things, silently, stubbornly, without complaint. He was buried on the hill above town, in the cemetery where the 63 miners who died in the explosion had been laid to rest 27 years before. His headstone, paid for by the families he had saved, bore an inscription that he had chosen himself. He prepared for what he hoped would never come. The coal shed still stands behind the house he built, maintained now by a historical society that considers it a monument to frontier prudence. Visitors sometimes stop to see it, a plain wooden structure, unremarkable in itself, distinguished only by the story it holds. They say that on cold December nights, when the wind blows down from the mountains and the snow piles deep against the walls, you can almost smell the coal smoke rising from the chimneys of a town that should have died, but didn't, because one man, who had learned to distrust luck, had spent 3 years filling his shed.